Bartenders of Reddit, what are some of the things drunk people have told you while completely hammered? Had a regular get drunk and recount a dream he had once about Freddy Krueger. Several years later, I'm having a conversation with someone about dreams in that same bar. He just happened to be sitting next to the customer I was chatting with, fairly drunk and idly listening to our conversation, so I decided to try it. This one time I had a dream that I was being chased down the street by Freddy Krueger. Then while he was chasing me, he grew really big and would cup his hands over the sun. He would do it really fast and there was this crazy strobe effect. This was nearly exactly how he had originally told it to me. About halfway into the story I noticed him look up. By the end of it, he was standing, tears in his eyes, scared to death that we had the same Freddy dream, yelling, "No fucking way, dude. No fucking way. Are you serious? Are you fucking with me right now? Yeah, dude, I'm fucking with you. You told me that story a few years ago and forgot." I had him going though. The story pretty much ends there. We had a good laugh. He let the relief wash over him. We went outside and smoked. I think he might have said good one at some point. I might have told him there's no such thing as Freddy at some point. My favorite was a regular who came up to the bar for a glass of red wine. At this point he was not yet a regular, it was his first time here. I poured the elderly man a nice glass of Pinot Noir, told him a little about the wine and the history of the building the bar is in, built in 1604. Course he seemed interested in it. He was. We chat a little, and he is overall a pleasant, but quirky, old man. At one point he looks at me and says, "You must know, I have a gift. I can read people's past. Not their current past, but previous lives. I can't do it with everyone, but I'm getting strong signals from your past. Would you like to know yours?" We are now joined by another regular of mine, a girl I was actually trying to get with at the time, but this sadly never happened. I pour the man another glass, pour myself one too because this is about to get good. He tells me what he sees and feels in my past lives. There is one life he can see very clearly, but it's a bit shocking, he says. I tell him to go on. The girl is asking all kind of in your face questions. She's being a little annoying honestly. The old man ignores them, or answers them if she can, and tells me about this previous life I lived. He tells me I was an Irish boy, I have a big red beard, go figure, and that my family and I felled Ireland during the famine. We got on a boat to New York, my mom died on the boat and I joined a gang in New York. I eventually die in a gang fight with a rival gang. Sounds familiar, right? Well, when the man went to the bathroom I checked and indeed, Gangs of New York was on cable the night before. The man comes back, and the girl and I play along. He tells me some more details about the movie, I mean, my previous life. I go along with his bullshit, until he stops talking about it. Then the girl turns to him, and asks me, "Can you see my previous life?" He looks at her, takes a sip of his wine and says, "Yes. Yes, you were a monkey." I'm a bartender / waiter at a restaurant in Puerto Rico. After Hurricane Irma the owner bought a huge ass power generator, so we wouldn't go out of business. We were fine for a few days, before we got our asses kicked by Hurricane Maria. I was able to get back to work 5 days after the Maria hit and holy shit I have never had such an emotional day at work. I worked for 12 hours straight selling bottled water and sodas due to the dry law. After about maybe the 8th straight hour working the place started to empty due to the curfew. There was military enforcing people to go home before nightfall. I was cleaning up the place when an older gentleman, Vietnam vet and coincidentally a diehard Steelers fan, just like me, came over for a whiskey sour. At first I told him I couldn't sell it to him because of the dry law and I could get in really big fucking trouble. Turns out he's friends with all the military surrounding the area, and he had permission for one drink. I served him the drink and he just straight up asks me, "How are you, man? How's your family?" That destroyed me. I hadn't seen my parents in days. Had no cell signal, so I couldn't call them. I had just moved in with my GF, and after the storm she had to stay with her mom, because she lived closer to her job. I was incredibly alone and felt hopeless. I just started crying and talking to the guy and eventually calmed down, but holy shit I needed a good cry. Somewhat related. I used to work in a bar across from a large hospital. I had one guy spend a lot of time in the bar while his wife was in the hospital across the street, having a difficult childbirth. He told me my martinis were the best and promised to name his child after me. I of course dismissed this as the drunken ramblings of a madman. Came in a couple weeks later and showed me the birth certificate of his daughter. She had 4 middle names, one of which was a feminized version of mine. To this day I'm kicking myself for not asking who the other 3 were named after. I wonder if any of them were other bartenders. Been a bartender for years. Have old ladies trying to pick me up pretty regularly. Have had drug dealers slide me $50 bills. Have had people try to fight me because I cut them off or it was last call. The craziest things is the people I see cheating or the people that are learner swingers. I live in a pretty small town, so it's weird to see. I've had some bad experiences, but I've also had some great ones. I took social work in college as a stepping stone to get into policing, but had kinda given up after not being able to find a job in social work. I was serving some guy at the bar top and suddenly he calls me over and out of nowhere says you're into policing, eh? I was pretty confused, cause I hadn't mentioned it at all, and I've never seen this guy. I asked him how he knew. He replied, I've been a cop for 30 years. We know a cop when we see one. And this motivated me. I explained my situation and how I couldn't find a job, and he gave me a bunch of tips and pointers on how to get into policing, and I was just really appreciative. He was sitting there quiet all night not saying anything till suddenly he bursts into conversation like that. I was pretty confused, but he was a great guy. I have had so many bizarre people walk into the bar I work at. It's a really small place that people enjoy drinking quietly at. Over the years I've had a range of odd topics, from a restaurant owner admitting he never sold fresh food to people unless they knew him, to a person admitting stalking and eventually assaulting a woman, which made him move to a new city. Lots of people end up talking about how they have no one to talk to about their problems, so I guess they find comfort telling a stranger who doesn't have an obligation to care. I used to be a barman at a private function venue. Often had people who did okay, but considered themselves as rich and incredibly wealthy. These middle-aged/older men would brag to a 19-year-old about how much more money they earned than me, and that I obviously made some mistakes to get there. Being the slippery bastard that I am, I'd usually converse and listen, ask questions about how they got to be so successful, and quite often they'd give me a good luck in the future tip. Worth it. It also taught me a lot about discussing what you earn. Don't. Man, so many to choose from here. I'll give a few of my favorites. The time this woman was talking to me and started to complain about her boyfriend's penis. He was sitting next to her, she didn't notice. The time some drunk guy gave me an ID. That was obviously fake. I denied him, and he said no, it's fake, it's fine. But my favorite happened when I was actually a cocktail waiter when I was 19. This smashed country woman grabbed my shirt and pulled me into to try and whisper, but was basically yelling while pointing at the guy next to her at the bar. She said, I'm going to fuck this guy. He looked confused and replied, I don't know you. What made it so funny was the guy's girlfriend was on the other side of him staring daggers at this woman. Extra story, when I was a cocktail I actually got knocked out by a drunk guy who tried to punch another guy, but was so drunk he missed wide right and made contact with me. When I came to, he was on the ground by the bouncer and apologizing to me. I felt bad for that guy. There was this guy at the bar a few weeks ago. He was lonely and his face was completely hazy. He stayed until closure time without saying a single word beside what drink he wanted. Usually I don't, but this time I had lot of pity for the man, so I offered him the last round. He was the only client left. When it was time for me to go home, he asked really politely if I could knock him down and that he will give me 50 euros. I started laughing, but quick after I realized he was serious, so I tried to ask what's up and why do he wants me to do this. Told him that no money will make me hit an innocent man. He didn't answer, but he thanks me, then moved on. I called the police to describe the guy and let them know my fear that he does something stupid to himself. No news from him or police since, so I'm sure everything went good that night, thankfully. I once had a military guy, probably about 26, who was a regular at the bar I worked at last year. He would come in alone to chat with my coworker, and I seemed pretty lonely. This bar was in a smaller town with not a great scene or much military presence. Anyway, one slow night he comes in right before I'm about to close and asks me for a whiskey sour. I make it for him, but before I can even give it to him, he looks up at me with the saddest face and says I have something to confess. I take steroids. I was pretty speechless, so I said at least it isn't heroin. And on the next breath he goes I take them up my ass. I've never told anyone that. And slumps down in his chair. I have no idea if he had a bad sexual encounter or if the weight of his use was just too much to keep private anymore, but I honestly felt bad for the guy. Wonder where he ended up. I have two favorite stories. The first one is one time, while I was working my husband stopped by to visit me and he was flirting big time. The guy next to him who was blasted leaned over and attempted to whisper, but ended up shouting she definitely wants to go home with you, but I don't know how. If you noticed she is wearing a wedding ring, tread lightly. My husband started laughing and said well she is my wife, so I hope she wants to come home with me. My second favorite story was when this girl came in with this guy. The whole time he was this sleazy asshole to her, constantly putting her down and touching her inappropriately, even though she constantly told him to stop. Later he went to the restroom and she admitted this was their first date and she didn't know what to do. She was really scared. Then she went to the bathroom just to get away for a while. When the guy came back he poured something into her drink thinking no one saw. Right as she was coming back I picked up her drink and dumped it on his head and told the bouncer what happened. I have never seen the bouncer happier than when he literally picked this guy up and threw him out. The girl and I are now best friends. And my favorite / most fucked up one from a girl in her late 20s, early 30s. We had a function hall upstairs, huge room with its own separate bar. The toilets were on the ground floor, one level down. This cute, very drunk girl came to the bar and said that the room was a bit smelly and that we should check the toilets downstairs. The loos didn't smell, but there was a strong miasma of shit in the air, so I had the joyous task of investigating. Turns out, a guest, who we think must have done a lot of coke, had struggled to find the toilet, despite the signs, and had tried to use a small lift instead, but had run out of time and just shit herself. So she had taken off her tights, wrapped up her shit, and put them in someone else's handbag. Never found out who did it, so we could only assume she had left straight after that by taking the stairs past the loos early. Had two really macho looking Marines come into the bar one night. They were doing some hardcore gay bashing. About an hour later, after some serious drinking, we found them in a dark corner of the bowling alley making out and pulling each other's clothes off. I had one guy who claimed to have studied sociology / psychology while in the army, started telling me about how much he knew about soldiers' brains, and made it clear he was actively analyzing me and testing the reactions of my coworkers. It was very uncomfortable, as I'm already aware of how screwed up I am and complexes I have, but hoped it wasn't that obvious. He did tip me though, so he's definitely far from the worst customer I've ever had. Regular quiet fellow. Usually stayed for 1 or 2 pints and then headed out. It was several weeks before he opened up. He wasn't hammered when he told me. It was really just conversation. But he had killed a guy while driving under the influence. He started coming to my bar after he finished his prison sentence. He seemed pretty damn choked up about it. I always wonder how he's doing. I got out of the business though, lost touch with the regulars.